We have a high-stakes battle, as you know, Thomas, over President Biden's student loan relief plan. That was it reached the Supreme Court on Tuesday of this week.
Yeah, they had an argument on it.
Correct. And each justice is giving their glimpse into their thinking during the back-to-back oral arguments that have taken place. Basically, what the plan appears to say is the administration's authority to give up to $20,000 in student debt for qualifying borrowers in two separate challenges. Certainly, I have my opinions on this. I know you have yours. But from a legal perspective, do you think there's any chance that this will pass in the Supreme Court?
Well, as Jim Carrey said, there's always a chance.
Yeah,
right?
That's true.
Look, what it comes down to this. This is a chance for the Supreme Court to rein in governing by emergency by the presidents.
Yep.
Okay? It doesn't matter if you think student debt cancellation is a good idea or a bad idea. Okay? If you're thinking like that, you're thinking in the short game. What's been going on is presidents have been using their emergency powers in order to do end around Congress. Look, the way our government's set up, and nobody talks about this in the media, it's all about the merits of helping these students out, right? Congress is the one that is supposed to appropriate funding and spend taxpayer money. And the way the presidents get around this is they declare emergencies. And that's what Biden did here. So he goes, this is an emergency. What's the emergency? COVID. Well, even though COVID has been declared not to be an emergency anymore officially by the CDC, he goes, no, but these students are now in a worse off position. So we are going to use my emergency power to get funding for student debt relief. And the way he's getting this power is there was a lot of emergency powers granted to the office of the president after 9/11 in 2001. There was something called the HEROES Act in 2003 that got passed. And that act was Congress going, look, if there are soldiers and soldiers' families, because of an emergency situation, such as a war that they're sent off to, we're granting the president emergency powers to be able to affect certain things and do debt relief. It was originally supposed to be for soldiers, then soldiers' families, and it's been broadened and broadened and broadened. And Biden's administration is reaching back to the HEROES Act to go, COVID was an emergency, and we're allowed under certain parameters of the statute now to reduce student loan debt because it was an unforeseen consequence and they're in a worse position. So if you think back, and I've heard you say this a lot, Brian, how Donald Trump, he used emergency powers to build the border wall. Congress didn't want to give him the funding. They funded him a lot lower than the amount he did. And he goes, I'm going to declare an emergency. Immigration's an emergency. So now I'm going to give all the funding to the border wall that I want. Other things that have been declared emergencies. Immigrations have been a big thing. Let's think about in World War II, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Japan attacks. All of a sudden, they declared an emergency, and what did? They rounded up every Japanese citizen on the West Coast and put them into concentration camps. And the Supreme Court actually approved that back then under the Supreme Court Korematsu. They approved that. They said under the emergency powers, the president can do that. Now, in recent decades, the court has looked back at Korematsu and said, no, absolutely not. You're not going to do that. But these emergency powers have been used by the president over and over and over again, and it's been a presidential expansion of power ever since George Washington took office. It's been a slowly expanding presidential power, and that's one thing that's bipartisan on both sides. They try to expand that power, the president does. And this is a chance for the Supreme Court to rein that in, because it's not just the decision that here about student debt relief. There's another decision that they're looking at too, which is about the influx of migrants down to the southern border. There's a case that's up on appeal right there because the states are saying, look, you need to use this emergency power for us to be able to stop immigration. And so this emergency power, the first thing that needs to be done is there has to be a real emergency. So the thing the Supreme Court needs to decide here is what is the definition of emergency? And so it's my hope here that the Supreme Court strikes this down. As much as I'd like, my friends and everybody to get student loan forgiveness because it's a racket, but this is the problem. It's pretextual. Student loan forgiveness has been on the table for how many years? Student debt in this country has been a problem for how many years? And it's pretextual in the same way the border wall is pretextual, is that now you're using your emergency power not for an emergency. You're using your emergency power as a president to affect policy decisions that you've been trying to get passed through that have not been able to get through Congress.
I understand that. My opinion when it comes to student loan debt is this. A lot of the arguments I hear from people, mainly people on the right, are I had to pay my student loan debt. You should have to pay yours. And my response to that is times change, laws change, people change, opinions change. And just because you have to suffer or had to suffer doesn't mean that people today have to suffer. I am for this bill.
It's not a bill. That's
Well,
the whole point that I'm making here. Congress is not passing this. Congress could do this.
The president is trying
The
to.
president is saying,
Right.
we're not going to even use Congress. I'm declaring an emergency.
Correct. The way that Donald
COVID
Trump
is an
did it.
emergency.
Understood.
And look, President Truman, back in the Korean War, he seized control of the steel industries. He declared an emergency, okay? And there was a case called Youngstown Sheet and Tube, and every law student has to learn this in con law. And the Supreme Court struck down, okay? Like I said, Roosevelt, when the Japanese attacked the Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt declared an emergency, and they rounded up all the Japanese into internment camps. That was Korematsu versus the United States, okay? President Trump manufactured an emergency at the southern border to access funding that Congress would not give him, okay? And this is what I mean. So the merits of what you're saying, that's a political thing that has to be done at the congressional level, in my humble opinion, because there is no emergency right now that Biden can point to. What he's pointing to is, oh, these students are having a little bit more trouble getting jobs because of the COVID pandemic, which, by the way, the CDC, under their emergency powers, they were able to restrict immigration. But the CDC, here's the thing, when the CDC says we're restricting immigration, every 90 days they have to have a formal decision out of the CDC again to go, we're still in emergency. We're still in emergency.
Well, let me ask
what
you this.
we've done, hold on, what we've done
Yeah.
is the presidents have kept us in a perpetual state of emergency.
Yes.
And Alexander Hamilton warned about this when they formed this country. He goes, anytime, look, a president has to have emergency powers. They have to, right? It's necessary. But whenever you give a president emergency powers, it is very susceptible to manufacturing of emergencies consistently. And that's what we've seen in this country. Now, Congress is not at fault. They delegated a lot of power after September 11th, right? And they've delegated more. But there's bipartisan support in Congress to restrict presidential power with these emergencies. And they need to do something about it. But this is all a separation of powers issue. And the only way the Supreme Court is going to knock this down, the way all the justices have hinted about it in an oral argument last week, was this. It's the issue of standing. You got to look at who's actually bringing this lawsuit to the forefront of the Supreme Court. And this is, I think the state of Nebraska is issuing a lawsuit, and then two other students who said, oh, they should be able to, they're being hurt by this bill. To have standing, you have to actually be experiencing a harm. So I can't sue on, like, Brian, let me give you an example. If we're in a criminal case and you had an illegal search done to you in your criminal case, I can't come in and go, I'm suing on behalf of Brian for that illegal search. I don't have standing to do that. The legal search didn't happen to me.
Yep.
It has to happen to you. And so this is the deal. Nebraska is not even the organization or entity that's giving out these loans. So the forgiveness of the loans doesn't hurt Nebraska, yet the state is suing. Why? Because it's political. Same thing with these students. They don't have standing to bring these cases. And I think that's how the Supreme Court kind of punts the issue, is they go, these people don't even have standing to bring these lawsuits in front of us. And that's what I would say 7 out of the 9 justices all kind of seem to agree with that at oral argument.
All right, so let me try to break it down for me, not from a legal perspective, but from my opinion, pragmatic perspective, whatever you'd like to call it. Thomas brought up, declaring a state of emergency, what Biden is doing here, and what Donald Trump did for the wall. Depends what your definition of an emergency is. Let me quickly just say, yeah, I think what's happening at the border is certainly a crisis. Some could call it an emergency. That's debatable. I would also tell you that there are a lot of people in this country that are in student loan debt that are working 3 jobs, that are suffering, that can't put food on the table. Some people would also call that an emergency. So I think it's the different case-by-case basis that there are people in this country that are homeless. There are people in this country that can't find work. There are people in this country that have no money, and they're in large student loan debt. There are some people in this country that do have jobs, but they have to make student loan.
Let me tell you, you're talking about definition of emergency.
Yeah.
Well, let's look at this is what it comes down to. What's the Webster's definition of emergency? It is unforeseen combination of circumstances which calls for immediate action.
Understand. There are some people that are homeless. There are some people that can't pay their bills. There are some people that are getting. Let me give you an example now, and you tell me if you think this is emergency or not. You're a single mother trying to raise 3 or 4 kids. You're in tremendous amount of student loan debt. They're taking money out of your paycheck to pay that student loan debt, which, by the way, they're legally allowed to do, as you know, in some cases. Because of that money that is being taken out, and that mother might already be on welfare. She might already be on food stamps. But she doesn't even now have the ability to gas money or to provide her children the care that they deserve. There are cases like that in this country. I would call that an emergency. Now, if you want to do it a case-by-case basis and say, we're not going to give you $20,000 in student loan debt because your situation is not
No, hold on. You think that's an emergency on the level of the president being able to use emergency powers to bypass Congress?
Well, if you're asking me about that, you correlated it to Donald Trump and building a border wall. I mean,
he's declaring a national emergency.
Right.
If you remember when Trump was in office, he kept saying, well, he said it about other things. He goes, I could declare a national emergency. I could declare a national emergency. Why? His legal advisors are telling him the way you bypass Congress is you declare an emergency. And what we've seen by president after president after president is they start declaring emergencies about everything. So here's what's really going on with Biden. Okay. He's declaring this emergency. They're going, let's do the student debt relief because the congressional support's not there. And now at re-election time, he can look at his constituency, which a lot of students are there going, at least you tried to get the student debt canceled, right? But ultimately, this is, for me, if the Supreme Court rules that this is an emergency, then what's not going to be an emergency?
Well, somebody on social media just said something interesting, and I want to comment on that. He said, when people die, it's an emergency. Let me remind you, the person that made that statement, that there are people dying in this country because of being in poverty. There are people dying in this country because they can't find a job and they can't support their kids or whatever.
Well, if that's the stance you're taking, that constitutes an emergency, we might as well have a king. We have an autocrat. And this isn't just how it happens in this country. It happens in a lot of countries where we have autocracies taking shape. These government officials who are supposed to be in charge and supposed to be checked by a legislative body like Congress are declaring emergencies constantly to go around.
I believe we have a lot of emergencies in this country. If some people think I'm using that term loosely, we have a lot of emergencies in this country. There are a lot of people suffering in this country financially. We have the homeless issue. Listen, some of this ties into student loans. I'm telling you, some of it does because I know people. I know people that have jobs right now, personally, people that have average jobs.
Let me ask you this. Let's go under definition of emergency. Unforeseen circumstance that requires immediate action. The student loan debt problem has been around for how long? We've been talking about it for how long?
We've been talking about it for a while.
So what's the sudden emergency? What Biden's saying, oh, COVID. COVID now makes it an emergency. I'm sorry, I don't buy it.
Well, it goes along defining what you think is an emergency or not. I disagree with you. I think that...
I mean, Trump used the definition of emergency. Why? To keep Muslims from being able to fly into the country. See, this emergency doctrine has been used to enforce racist policies for a long time in this country.
I agree with you. This is not a racist policy.
This is not a racist policy, but that's why I'm saying it's not about the merits of man, look, the institution of higher education is a racket, and it needs to be reformed. Mm-hmm. But what else we need to really check in this country is the expansion of presidential power to declare an emergency at any time and do whatever they want to do.
Well, here's the problem that I have, Thomas, with this whole thing. Let's just call it for what it is. This is a political issue. The overwhelming majority of Republicans do not want student loan debt. Thomas, during COVID, many of these Republicans who run businesses, even people in this city who are against student loan debt, had no problem with forbearance on their loans during COVID for their business. So they were able to get a loan. That was an emergency. Why? Because maybe they were in a financial hardship. Maybe not. They wanted to take care of their employees. They took a loan from the government that they never have to pay back. But yet many of these people who I can name, like Sam Peters in Las Vegas, who didn't win, thank God, in my opinion, is somebody who's against student loan forgiveness, but when it came to him personally, Republican, when it came to him and his business, he had no problem taking in a government loan and then not paying it back. That is the definition of hypocritical. He thought it was an emergency. When he was running his business, he was okay with taking a loan. Why is it okay for these people? And I'm not yelling at you. I'm just frustrated with the hypocrisy in this country. Why is it okay for some of these Republicans to take loans from the government and get that loan forbearance, and they're totally okay with that, but when it comes to a student loan forgiveness, they're against it? I find the hypocrisy is just disgusting to me, and that's why I get frustrated, Thomas, with this. I understand what you're saying. Some people wouldn't define this as an emergency. I think that's a very fair argument to have.
It's not about some people. It's about a legal definition. Look, let me tell you, Justice Robert Jackson, back in the Youngstown decision, when the Supreme Court said Truman could not seize the steel industry to just use it to help in the Korean War effort, we were at war in Korea. And the Supreme Court said, this is not going to fall under emergency powers here. You're not going to seize the entire steel industry and use it to affect the military operation over there. You're going to seize private industry. These are the kind of broad powers that presidents have sought to do. And what Justice Jackson said back then, he goes, look, the framers of our Constitution understood that emergency powers afford a ready pretext for usurpation. Mm-hmm. It means it is an ability for the president to go, if I can just find a way under the statutes to declare an emergency, I can do whatever I want. Now, look, do people have plights? Are they in dire economic situations? Yes, but that doesn't stand for the fact that now we should have a dictator like King sitting as the president who doesn't have to have any check on what they're doing by Congress. They can appropriate funding wherever they want to do. They can seize private industry. We might as well be living in China at that point.
Well, let's go to the phones. Let's see what you guys think out there. 702-221-7283. I think myself, Thomas, we disagree a little bit on this. I understand what he's saying from a legal perspective and even from a perspective of, do we want the president to just declare an emergency for anything? I understand that argument, but then we have, so many people on the right that take their own personal loans when it came to, or business loans when it came to COVID. They're totally okay with not paying those loans off, but when it comes to student loan forgiveness, no, we're not for that. All right, let's start off with Fernando. Fernando's first off on Pushing the Limits. Hi, Fernando. Thanks for calling in. What's on your mind, man?
Well, hey guys. With the student loan debt, so all the money that's being paid back goes straight to the government, right?
Correct.
Okay. I thought maybe the states would want to handle it themselves, but I guess not. But, back in the 80s when I was going to USC, a couple of people got student loans, and I believe it took them at least maybe 10, 15 years. It depends how much it was, but it took them about 10, 15 years to pay it off. And that was in 83, 84, and 85. And I have no problem, cut it down a little bit, help people out, help students, help our future a little bit, and it's okay to do that. I mean, not wipe it all away, but, sure, wipe off 20, 30,000% or something like that. But
listen, nobody's going to disagree with you on that. But what do you think about the issue with this, that the president is able to declare a national emergency and just appropriate funding to whatever the president wants to do, regardless of what Congress or anybody else? One man just gets to declare an emergency in any situation and start doing whatever he wants to do.
Yeah, I think they should let Congress take care of it, our lawmakers, and then go from there. But have a great weekend, fellas.
Thanks, Fernando. Appreciate your call, my friend. 702-221-7283. Let's go to John. I believe John is next on Pushing the Limits. What's up, John?
Hey, man.
What's up, John?
Thomas, my man. Hey, when you first started coming on this great radio program, you and I bumped heads, and it was always political. As a retired lawyer, I can say, sir, your legal analysis today is holy cow, spot on. You are sharp as a tack, sir.
Well, thank you.
Look, one of the most striking things that I remember is towards the end of Steve Jobs' life, he was doing some sort of program or seminar with Bill Gates. And he said one of his biggest regrets was they really hadn't used technology to improve education. And I was kind of taken aback by really? Wow, I mean, I'm old enough. I remember my high school had a computer where you had those punch cards. My first PC was the IBM PC Junior, and its hard drive was 0. You put everything on a floppy disk, and you had to save it on the floppy disk to take it out. So he's absolutely right. And you hit the nail on the head, Thomas. College is a racket. It needs to be reformed. Look, the powers that be seize on two things, and they exploit it. They seize on your fear and your hopes. And your fears, a shining example is healthcare, and how big pharma has wrestled in the the medical community has just totally run amok. And how much does an aspirin cost in a hospital? You should know what that number is. It could be anywhere from 50 cents to $150. We don't know. You don't know until you get the bill. And then with hope, that's where the college fits into this equation I'm putting forward. There's one professor in the legal community that teaches constitutional law, the best in the country. And that, the technology we have today, the very best constitutional law professor, we can beam him in or her in through a computer to every law student in the country. But no, every law school has to have, 10 constitutional law professors, and they all need salaries and pensions, and everybody's got to pay it, and we've got to maintain the buildings and so on and so forth.
I'll tell you this. When you go to any university, there's just like any business, you have your money-making parts of the business, and you have your parts that aren't making money. And the science departments, by and large, are not making money. They cost the university money because they're doing research. The law school is a huge moneymaker for them because, man, they bring these students in, they charge them exorbitant fees, and it's like you said, their whole thing is we want to keep the classroom small. We need more professors. Man, they make so much money at these law schools. That's why every school around the country is trying to open up a law school. You have online law schools opening, and it's ridiculous. And it slides a person like me into debt for a house when I get out. It's going to take me. It takes me 10 years to pay off my loan. Yeah. And John's right. There is a better way to do it, but education is big business, and it's dirty business.
John, always good to hear from you, my friend. Got to go to the next caller, but you have a good weekend, okay, my friend?
Before we go, let me ask you this, Brian, because you were talking about emergencies. So let's say the next president comes into office. You'd be all for him going, homelessness is an emergency. We're going to give $1 trillion to fight homelessness, start shifting it to the state governments. You guys can start building homeless camps. And everyone goes, we're against this. And the president goes, I've declared an emergency. I'm doing it.
Well, here's my response to that, to answer your question. We have major issues in this country that are not being addressed. It's getting worse. Homeless, drugs, healthcare, student debt, people that are not able to pay their bills. What we're doing right now, Republican or Democrat, Thomas, it's not working. So maybe this is an extreme, right? But we need people to come together and fix the problems in this country.
And they have to come together in Congress. My question to you is this. Next president comes into office. He goes, I'm declaring homelessness an emergency. I'm also going to declare, our business interests are going overseas. I'm declaring that an emergency. I'm not even going to ask Congress, you know what? I'm going to cut taxes for all the corporations so we can start driving business. And people go, well, that doesn't make sense policy-wise. And we go, well, the president just declared an emergency.
I think there has to be case-by-case basis. There has to be some reason, some reasonable things.
There has to be a limit to a president being able to just delegate our taxpayer money. This is what has happened even with our war efforts. Why do you think we're constantly at war? Because it keeps us in a constant state of emergency. The greatest thinkers in our country since the beginning of this country have been saying that you have to watch out for this. Yes, a president has to have the ability to move quickly. That's why we have a president.
I get it. I
But you can't call homelessness an emergency for the president to be able to go, I'm going to do whatever I want.
All right, let me ask you a question now. Why is it that it's okay for a middle-aged person or whatever your age is to get a loan and call it an emergency during COVID, which, by the way, I would tend to agree with? Your business could be falling apart, or maybe your business isn't falling apart. You just want to take care of your employees and continue to pay them. You can take a loan from the government and a loan forbearance. You don't have to pay any of those back. That's okay. That's an emergency. But those same people, some of them are policy.
Actually, a lot of that was passed through Congress.
I understand, but I'm just giving you the level of hypocrisy. We don't want to help these younger people with their student loan debt, but it's okay for me as a 50-year-old or 40-year-old or 60-year-old to take a loan from the government to help me because I consider that an emergency, but it's not an emergency for somebody that's 23 years old that can't pay their bills, that's a single mother. The PPP loans, it's absolute hypocrisy. And I totally understand what you're saying. No, to answer your question, I don't want a president to do whatever he or she wants to do and declare whatever they want in an
Then
emergency.
you need to be hoping that the Supreme Court reins it in on these decisions. You need to be hoping that.
I understand that, but it shouldn't have gone to the Supreme Court. Republicans and Democrats should have been able to come together to help people. And it's okay for them, Republicans I'm talking about now, to take their loans and for their private businesses and not pay those loans off. But when it comes to student loan debt, oh no, well, we don't have to worry about student loan debt anymore because mine's already paid off, or I'm 55 years old. I hear what you're saying and I don't disagree with you, but I get frustrated. You can hear it in my voice. It's hypocrisy. I don't have to pay student loan debt because I already paid mine off, even though I struggled with it. But it's okay to give me a loan for my private business. It is the definition of hypocrisy. And yes, I'm with you. I don't want a president to have free reins.
Here's the difference, okay? COVID was an unforeseen circumstance. Do you agree with that? No one knew COVID was going to happen. It happened. All of a sudden you hear
it was a global pandemic.
You heard in
sure.
January, hey, there's some kind of coronavirus going on.
Yes.
And all of a sudden March is like a country's just shut down. Businesses are shut down. Okay? That was a very unforeseen circumstance, and a lot of businesses went under, and the government took measures, immediate measures to try and help through that.
Sure.
The difference with student debt relief is this. Student debt relief has been on the table for decades. So just because you haven't been able to affect your policies through Congress, now a Democratic president comes up and goes, I'm just going to declare an emergency and affect my Democratic policies. Same way when a Republican president came up, Trump, and he goes, oh, we want to shut down the border and we haven't been able to do it through Congress. I'm going to declare an emergency. This is a problem in this country. And it's been going this way for a long time.
But to use your words of unforeseen, there are also a lot of people in this country, maybe they were going to college, maybe they had just gotten out of college, and they weren't able to get work. They weren't able to get a job. So, I hear what you're saying. You're right. COVID was unforeseen. And for a lot of these people that were getting out of college.
And the CDC was able to restrict immigration based on their emergency powers that have been delegated to them by Congress. But the CDC has declared that it's no longer an emergency.
Sure.
But even after that declaration, the Biden administration is now going, oh, it's not a present emergency, but it's an emergency because now these students have not been able to get jobs like they would have before. It's very attenuated for the president to come out and do this. So
maybe it is.
And if the Supreme Court says Biden can do this under emergency powers,
they're not.
Then Biden will be. Then Biden, not only Biden, and this is what I mean. You got to play the long game with a decision like this. Not Biden. Every president moving forward will be able to use their emergency powers for almost anything.
I think there needs to be limits, but I will tell you there is no chance that this is going to pass. And the reason why it's not going to pass is because it is a conservative Supreme Court, and this will never pass. If there were Democrats, it probably would pass. The overwhelming majority of those on the Supreme Court.
No, you're wrong about that.
Why am I wrong?
Well, number one, this is kind of a bipartisan issue with the judiciary.
Oh, you mean I'm talking about
for separation
this
of powers?
But
you're talking about the merits of this.
Yeah,
and that's not what this case is about. No one's going to disagree that we should be helping these students out of this racket that they got themselves.
You don't
into.
think so? Have you heard what some of these Republicans have said? They don't want to help these students.
But the court is not concerned with the merits. The court should never be involved in the merit. Going, this policy is a good idea. We're going to approve it. This policy is a bad idea. No, it's whether or not the president can even do this.
Understood.
And it's a bipartisan issue within the court of whether the president should be having this power or not. Now, conservatives, by and large, like to cede power to the president. Conservative judges would be looking at it from that angle.
Call me crazy.
So that's when I say it's bipartisan.
I understand, but call me crazy. I don't think really today there are many issues at all within the Supreme Court that are bipartisan. Call me crazy. There's a lot of political bias there. We could be talking about a lot of other issues, and they vote based on what party they're in, Democrat and Republican. And I understand this, those on Supreme Court justices are not supposed to do that. But if you look at the way they vote and the history of the way they vote, literally almost every situation, to me, there's political bias, in my opinion.
No, you're right about that. But the point here is this. You're saying something needs to be done. There's all these emergencies. Mm-hmm. But we should be able to step in and handle these emergencies without Congress here. Well, you're asking for a country that looks much different than America, okay? And if that's the issue that these judges hang their hat on and go, we are going to reject this case because no standing, and so Biden will be able to push this through, That's punting the issue from what the issue really needs to be.
Well, looking
laying
down
out
the road.
emergency doctrine for future presidents.
looking
of what's
down
gonna
the road
happen. If
for
you
two-
punt this for standing,
We're looking down the road for other things that, but in my personal opinion, it shouldn't have gone to the Supreme Court. Let's get back to the call, 702-221-7283. I believe we have Michelle waiting patiently on hold. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, thanks for your patience. Go ahead.
Oh, no, that's absolutely fine. I have a unique perspective on this situation because I am 41. I had a college education. I paid off my student loans. At the onset of COVID, I decided I wanted to go into nursing school because of the need. I quit my federal job. I had enough in savings to get me through the pandemic and into this private school because of an accelerated program, and I got completely screwed. I live in Las Vegas, where there is no rent control. Our rent doubled, single income, and then to go online and see people like Ted Cruz saying that I'm a lazy bong smoking like barista. It's very insulting. It shows how out of touch Congress is with the American people. And it shows that we're being stigmatized, and that's not the nation I grew up in.
Agreed.
My grandmother bought her house in 1973 for $20,000, which was affordable at the time as a single mom. She had 2 children, my aunt and my father. That is unconceivable in this day and age.
Wouldn't
There's
you
no
consider
way.
that to be an emergency? What you've had to go through financially, financial hardship? I think that's an emergency.
I absolutely think it does. In the debate whether or not the president should have the authority as to declare what is an emergency or not. And I'm also a veteran, and I still believe
Thank you for your service.
The military has a thank you. If we have carte blanche in terms of national defense, and we can spend trillions of dollars in that arena, why can't we take a small fraction of that cost and remedy some of the problems that we have in the nation? Because homelessness is an issue.
Amen.
You know, child care. How can anybody come up from a socioeconomically disadvantaged place if not helped out a little bit, or at least not held down by, you know, corporations that aren't even paying their fair share in taxes?
Michelle, you're exactly the person that I was describing to Thomas, and we can disagree on whether a president should or shouldn't call for an emergency, and I understand Thomas's point there, but you're here you are. You risked your life for this country, right? You're a hero. You're struggling financially, not because you're lazy. I don't give a crap what Ted Cruz says. He's just going to fly to the Cancun cruise. He's despicable. But here you are risking your life for this country. You're the opposite of lazy. You're a hard worker. You know, COVID affected you. You know, the work, you name it. We should be helping people like you. I consider people like you in this country, that's an emergency. You risked your life for this country, and we should be helping people like you and stop giving tax breaks to the the Fortune 500 companies. And yes, I do believe when Joe Biden speaks, he's talking about people like you.
Yeah, and we can't fail to remember that people are going to take advantage in any situation that they are in, whether or not they're doing well or if they're super poor. There's going to be good and bad in both arenas. So do we take away from the people that are going to better their lives and better this country as a whole, or are we going to punish everybody?
Yeah, Michelle,
and that's
I'm with you.
where I stand.
I'm with you, Michelle. God bless you. I appreciate you calling to this show. You call back, okay?
All right. Thank you so
All right.
much.
Nice lady there who risked her life for this country. I feel for her. Her rent doubles. And I understand what Thomas is saying. I get it, right? Do you really want a president to be able to declare emergency for anything with no ground rules at all? That's also very dangerous. I get that. I don't think it's dangerous in this specific situation, but I also understand your point where, well, you're just going to give him free reins down the road?
This is one of the biggest overreaches of emergency power by a president that there's been. I mean, the COVID is over, and he's going, no, we're still going to declare an emergency here. That's why, look, I know there's some people out there that go, look, definitely these petitioners don't have standing, and the Supreme Court could deny it. But that's why this separation of powers emergency doctrine issue isn't just with the case that we're talking about right now, which is Biden v. Nebraska. Okay. There's a companion case that was also heard, Arizona v. Mayorkas. And it's about Biden's administration using emergency powers to restrict migration from certain countries during COVID. In some of these states, Arizona in particular, Biden's administration said, we stopped the emergency on that.
Yeah.
And these states are going, no, you have to continue the emergency on this or else we have no way of combating it.
Right.
So the court has a pair of decisions right now to really issue some longstanding precedent on restricting emergency powers by the president. And if you disagree with restricting emergency powers by the president because it's been expanding for so long, then you're asking to live in a dictatorship, man. I'm sorry. Like, I agree with you policy-wise, merit-wise, but Congress needs to hash that out. And I know you're saying Congress isn't working. What that sounds to me is saying we want a dictatorship again. As long as we have a good dictator. Look, a benevolent dictatorship is one of the best forms of government in history. The problem is, how do you know you got a benevolent dictator who's going to do things right? How do you know the next guy is going to be benevolent? That's why we put these systems into place. And it's slow working, and it seems broken, and maybe it is broken. But by God, I got to think that ceding power to this president, and then, okay, you cede that power to Biden right now. He's allowed to do it. Let's say Trump does win the 2024 election, who I know you can't stand Trump. And he starts declaring emergencies around the clock. And they go, well, under the precedent set in Biden v. Nebraska, he's allowed to do all of this now. What if he goes, hey, I'm going to declare an emergency. Giving all that money back to the students hurt business. I'm going to declare an emergency. We need the money back from the students. Oh, you're going to be like, oh, no, he can't do that. It's like, well, the Supreme Court laid it out for all these future presidents to be able to do this.
I would argue with you that we already have some levels of dictatorship in office right now.
No, that's my point. Presidential expansion of power has been going on since the beginning of this country. And Congress has repeatedly, over and over again, ceded more power to the president. And when do they do that? It's when wartime hits. Because war is an emergency. We need the president to be able to act fast when we're hit. And September 11th, a lot of power was ceded over to the government by Congress on September 11th. A lot. And it hasn't been restrained back. And Obama continued that. And Trump continued that. And Biden is continuing this. Because one bipartisan thing of every president that you get into office says they want more power. The president doesn't get in office and say, you know what? We need less power as a presidency.
Well, in general terms, I will close by saying this. I say this every day on and off the air. The two worst words in this country are Republican and Democrat, because too many people make decisions based on what's better for their party and not what's best for the country. And this is a prime example of why Joe Biden had to take it to the Supreme Court. It's not going to pass. It shouldn't have gone to the Supreme Court. Okay, we should be able to help people that are in major student loan debt. There are people in this country that will never pass anything in Congress, anything even close to this. I agree with you. We don't want dictators, even though we have some already that are governing in some states. We don't want dictatorship. I agree with you. And it's a slippery slope, and it's dangerous. Again, I don't disagree with you. This is a reasonable situation that should have been dealt with in Congress. No Republican seems to be okay with student loan debt forgiveness. So what did Joe Biden do? Joe Biden and his administration, they know it's not going to pass. They know it. It's so that he could do, and he could say he did everything he could, and maybe part of it is political as well, to try to get votes to be reelected, but that he could say he did everything he could, and now it's out of his hands. It's in the hands of the Supreme Court. It's not going to pass. It shouldn't have gotten to this point. And we have a lot of emergencies in this country. Yes, I would consider those that are in poverty, those that are struggling, can't pay their bills. That's an emergency. Homeless, healthcare, violence, gun violence. We have so many different issues in this country to deal with. And I don't like where we're going. And that's not, one person's fault. It's both sides. They can't work together. They can't get things done. Anyway, Thomas, we only have 2 minutes here left to go. So pleasant.
I just got to reiterate.
Okay, go ahead.
There's a difference between a long-standing problem or a crisis and an emergency. An emergency happens. You call 911. You don't call 911 and say, hey, I've been having this cough for 5 years now. I got to call 911 emergency now to have an ambulance come get me. No. You get injured really badly right at that moment. You need immediate help, immediate action. That's when you call 911. That's the analogy I got to make here. And so when you're talking about gun violence, you're talking about homelessness, you're talking about student debt, you're talking about immigration. These are longstanding policy issues, which, look, you have your own stance on that, and you're going, I can't believe the Republicans are not on board. Well, The Republicans get elected by a majority in this country. Also, that's how they get into office. A majority elects a Republican into office. So there's a bunch of people on the other side who disagree with you, and longstanding policy decisions are not supposed to be declared by one person in the presidential seat and go, I'm declaring an emergency. I'm going to affect longstanding policy.
Understood.
There has to be a vote in Congress to pass it.
Understood, but
That's
I would
all- that's
also
all
say
it's about.
I would also say Republicans did not get the majority of the vote 6 of the last 7 presidential elections either. So I would
No
say most
presidential election, but we're talking about see, the Congress passes the law. They spend the money. Okay, they spend the tax money. The president is our foreign policy.
Understood.
Because we have to have one figurehead for that, and domestically acts in times of emergencies.
Every poll that I've seen, though, as far as Americans are concerned, almost 6.5, 7 out of 10 Americans believe that this is the right thing to do, that Joe Biden is doing the right
But
thing.
it's not about the right thing or wrong thing. It's about Biden. He does not have the power to do this. Okay,
Understood.
because if you let a president do this
Yep.
for the right thing,
Yep.
the president's going to be able to do it for the wrong thing.
I understand. All I'm saying is when the overwhelming majority of Americans are on board with this, and Congress, Republicans in Congress are not, that's why things aren't getting done. I'm not blaming it all on Republicans. That's my only point that I'm making here. I understand that we don't want the president to be able to declare a state of emergency for absolutely anything. That's very dangerous, and that would be a dictatorship. But at the same time, when you have a bunch of buffoons in Congress that are not doing the right thing, and overwhelming majority of Americans agree with me, I'm not in the minority here, that's a problem, and it needs to be fixed. Anyway, Mr. Moskal, always a pleasure having you in again on a Friday. I hope I don't know what you're up to this weekend, but whatever it is, anything fun? No?
Yeah, no, I hope you have a fun weekend too, man.
Yeah, man. Just
I'll be working.
Working as usual. That's why Thomas is wearing a suit and I'm wearing a sweatshirt. Anyway, thanks for joining us, everybody. It's been a fun show. Everybody, follow me on YouTube. PTL Vegas is the fan page. YouTube PTL Vegas. Subscribe. It's free. Thomas is also very active on social media as well. Follow us both on there, and I appreciate all of you watching on all social media platforms and on the radio. We'll see you Monday, same time, same place. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Yeah.